Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge. In today's tutorial episode, we're going to be talking about the supply system in World in Flames. And despite the size of the game and the complexity of the game, the supply system is relatively straightforward and simple. But that's not to say that it is an unimportant or minor aspect of the game. Indeed, keeping your troops in supply and cutting your opponent's troops out of supply can be key to your success. So with that said, let's take a look and see exactly how supply works in World in Flames. Now, in order for your units to be effective, they have to be in supply. And WiFCE's supply system is a binary one, meaning your units are either in supply or they're out of supply. And to determine that, it uses a trace system. So there are no supply points that have to be saved up or moved around the map or expended in order for units to do various actions. Simply each unit, land, air, and sea, traces a supply path from the unit back to a supply source. There are two types of supply sources in the game: primary supply sources and secondary supply sources. Now, a primary supply source is any friendly city in the unit's unconquered home country. Now, for the Commonwealth, that includes all 6 of their home countries. So you've got the UK, Australia, India, and the rest of them. Also, a primary supply source is any friendly city in an unconquered home country of a major power that the unit can cooperate with. So once the United States is in the war, since the United States and the Commonwealth can cooperate, any city in the UK acts as a primary supply source for any American unit as well as any Commonwealth unit. One thing to keep in mind in China is that communist Chinese cities that they control, like Lanzhou or Xi'an, are not supply sources to the nationalists. Nationalists and communists are not considered friendly with one another, even though they are nominally on the same side in the fact that they're both fighting the Japanese. Same thing with the nationalist-controlled cities. Communist units cannot trace to a nationalist-controlled city in order to trace supply. Now, to be in supply, the unit must trace a supply path from the unit to the primary supply source. And that supply path can be no more than 4 hexes in length. And that length can be modified by the weather, as we saw in last episode. For example, when it's rain, the supply path range is reduced to 2 hexes instead of the normal 4. Also, on the Pacific maps, each hex you trace into counts as 2 hexes. And if you are tracing into a desert or desert mountain hex on any map, that counts as an additional hex. So on the European maps, a desert hex counts as 2 hexes of the supply path. Also, you cannot trace supply into an opponent's enemy-occupied hex or a hex that has an enemy zone of control in it, unless that hex also has a friendly unit in it where it will negate that zone of control. You also cannot cross hex sides that an infantry unit could not cross, such as alpine hex sides or unfrozen lake hex sides. Now, as you can see, Germany is way more than 4 hexes away from the Soviet Union. So how do you ever get German units in supply into the Soviet Union? Well, that's where secondary supply sources come in. Now, a secondary supply source is a headquarters unit that the unit can cooperate with, or a friendly city in an unconquered Commonwealth major powers home country other than the UK. Cities in the UK are always primary supply sources for any major power that can cooperate with the Commonwealth. But a city in, say, India would be only a secondary supply source for the United States, as an example. However, for Commonwealth units, any city in India is a primary supply source, as well as Australia and South Africa, etc. Also, secondary supply sources are the capitals of either conquered or aligned minor countries that your unit can cooperate with. So in Poland, for instance, Warsaw here acts as a secondary supply source for all German units that are in the area, as well as any Italian units once the Italians are at war and cooperating with the Germans. Now, whether you're tracing a supply path back to a primary supply source or a secondary supply source, it is referred to as a basic supply path, and that is the supply path that is only 4 hexes in length. So as an example, the 2 German infantry corps here can trace back 4 hexes to Breslau, which is in Germany and a primary supply source for both of these units. However, the infantry corps that is in Warsaw cannot trace 5 hexes to Breslau. So it can't trace to Breslau because the path is too long. It can, however, trace to Warsaw, which is a secondary supply source. Once you trace to a secondary supply source, that secondary supply source can then trace a path from there back to a primary supply source, but it must use the railways as you see printed on the map here. This is known as a railway supply path that differentiates it from the basic supply path that units use. So you could have, as an example, you could have the German Infantry Corps over here. It is 3 hexes from Warsaw, so it'll trace a basic supply path 1, 2, 3 back to Warsaw. Once it gets to Warsaw, the supply path goes along the rail lines to a primary supply source, in this case Breslau. It could also go along the rail line up to Königsberg, which is in East Prussia and considered part of the German home country for all purposes. Similarly, you can see where you can chain together different secondary supply sources to increase the length of the overall supply source. And I'll show you an example of that. Now here we've moved further east into the Soviet Union, and our infantry corps has advanced on its way to Moscow. In order to be in supply, it needs to be able to trace back to a primary or secondary supply source. In this case, it's using the Rundstedt headquarters, and it is 4 hexes away. Assuming it's fine weather, the basic supply path is long enough to reach the secondary supply source. Rundstedt then can trace an unlimited distance along an unbroken rail line back to either another secondary supply source from which it can continue to trace, or he can just trace all the way back up to Königsberg here, or the supply line goes through and back eventually to Breslau in Germany. Now you can begin to see why headquarters are so important to you and so valuable, because one of their main functions is to keep all of your forces in supply as they get further and further from their home country. Now, railways and headquarters work fine for continental powers like the Soviet Union and maybe Germany, but not so well for an island nation like the Commonwealth or Japan. Well, you are allowed to trace part of your supply path across sea zones. It's referred to as an overseas supply path. Any unit that is in a coastal hex can trace a part of their basic supply path through a sea zone to a port on the other side, and then continue along with the basic supply path to a primary supply source. Or it could be a railway supply path if they're tracing to a secondary supply source. Now, you cannot trace supply through a sea zone if there are enemy aircraft carriers, surface combat ships, or air units with air-to-sea factors in that sea zone, unless you also have one of those in there as well. The number of sea zones is irrelevant. You can have an unlimited number of sea zones. They do not count against any of the 4 hexes of the basic supply path. Now, if a unit is not in a coastal hex, if it's inland, it can still trace a basic supply path back to a port, and then from there across the sea zones back to a primary supply source. But it cannot trace to a non-port hex. Likewise, the units could trace to a headquarters unit that is on the coast. Now, if the headquarters unit is not in a port, it is limited to the number of units that it can supply overseas. In this case, it's limited to its reorganization value. So Gort would be able to supply the 2 corps here with him in France, but he wouldn't be able to supply any additional corps unless he were occupying a port. If he's in a port, as he is here, then he acts as a regular secondary supply source, and he can trace overseas directly to London, which is a primary supply source, or he could trace to Harwich and use the rail line with the railway supply path. Now keep in mind, you can chain together multiple secondary supply sources when tracing back to your ultimate primary supply source to determine if a unit is in supply or not. There's an excellent example on page 9 of the rulebook, and I'll run through that right here for you. We're looking at Iraq and Syria, and we'll assume that all of Syria is Axis controlled except for Damascus here and the hex that contains the French territorial. To determine if the German motorized corps in Iraq is in supply, it will first trace a basic supply path of 4 hexes back to Rundstedt. Remember that desert hexes cost an extra 1 when tracing supply, so it would be 2, 4. Rundstedt is unable to trace a railway supply path back to the primary supply source, though, because he's got 2, 4 to the rail line. When he goes to Tripoli, he's used all 4. Remember, the hex you trace into on the other end of your overseas supply path does count as 1 hex, so that would be 5 hexes, and that's too long for a basic supply path. However, Rundstedt is able to trace to von Bock, 4 hexes, again, a basic supply path. And this shows you why headquarters are so important, because they, being units, they also have the ability to use a basic supply path to trace back to a secondary supply source. However, there are also secondary supply sources that are able to use railway supply paths. So we go from the motorized corps to Rundstedt. Rundstedt traces to von Bock, who goes 1, 2, 3 hexes to the rail line, then traces a railway supply path to the port of Tripoli, which becomes an overseas supply path, and the 4th and final hex of the basic supply path is in a port in Italy, which then continues the railway supply path into Germany and reaches the primary supply source eventually. Now that you know how to trace supply, the next question is, when do you need to check it? You need to check the supply status of a unit before it moves, flies, or sails. Additionally, for land units, you will need to check the supply status of both the attacker and the defender immediately before you conduct an overrun. The attackers will need to check the moment that they declare an attack, and also you need to check the supply status of both the attacker and defender at the moment of the attack. So the 3 extra times you need to check for land units are before an overrun for both sides, during the attack declaration for the attackers only, and during the resolution of the attack for both sides. A unit that is in supply is free to act without limitation or penalties. But if the unit is found to be out of supply, it depends upon whether the unit is a land unit, an air unit, or a naval unit. For land units that are out of supply, they can't attack. If they move, they are turned face down, and that includes if they are moved by naval transport or air transport. Also, if they are out of supply and face down, when they are attacked, they will defend with a strength of 1 instead of their normal defense strength. So this Japanese motorized corps, which normally has a 5 combat factor, will defend at a strength of 1 if it is face down and out of supply. If it's face down and in supply, it still defends with the 5. If it's a white print unit, it will defend with a 3 instead of its normal printed factor. So as a general rule of thumb, in WIF, it's bad to be face down, but to be face down and out of supply is very, very bad. Air units can only fly rebase missions if they are out of supply. Naval units can move, however, they will have 1 subtracted from their movement, not their range, just their movement. And when they end their move, they are turned face down, even if they end their move at sea. One thing to keep in mind is that naval units that are at sea are always considered to be in supply. The penalty for being out of supply is judged before they sail. So what you're really doing is checking to see if the port that they're stacked in supply. If it's out of supply, they can still sail. They suffer the -1 to their movement penalty, which will potentially affect what sea box they can be placed in. And then being turned face down, it will prevent them from initiating any naval searches to try to begin a combat. However, if any combat occurs that involves the sea box they're in, they will still participate. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the naval combat episode in the tutorial. Well, that's pretty much it for the supply rules in the game. As you can see, it's a trace system. It's fairly unobtrusive, doesn't take a lot of rules overhead, and you're starting to see, I think, the importance of headquarters units. When you're on the attack, they are absolutely vital to keep your units in supply as you drive into the enemy's home countries. And conversely, it makes it a lot easier to destroy those enemy armies if they happen to be face down and out of supply. Best way to get them out of supply is to either kill the enemy headquarters that is supplying them, or cutting off the railway lines on the map that they're using to trace back to their primary supply sources. Next episode, I think we're going to talk a little bit about the impulse types and the impulse selection. We mentioned that a little bit in the orientation video, but I'll go into a little more detail next time, and then we'll be ready to get in to see how land units move and fight. Thanks for watching again today, and we'll see you next time.